14 men went into the Arkansas wilderness hunting one fugitive. None of them came back. The year was 1863, and the name written across 3 counties' fugitive logs carried a whisper that froze blood. Bass Reeves. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a legend. He was something far worse, a man who had learned through pain and silence how to turn the tools of his captivity into weapons of freedom. For 6 years, Reeves worked the forge like a craftsman of death, memorizing every patrol route, every weapon, every sound the night made before violence came. When he finally struck, he didn't run, he hunted. Bodies appeared in the timber, strangled or crushed with mechanical precision. Men vanished without a sound. Dogs refused to track him. By the time authorities realized what they were facing, 14 pursuers lay dead, and a new name was whispered in the dark: the Reaper of Miller County. What kind of man could turn survival into mathematics? And why did history bury him so deeply that even his victims' families were told he never existed? Tonight we uncover the truth. The air inside the blacksmith shop shimmered with heat. Iron hissed in the water trough, and sparks leapt like fireflies caught in chains. The man at the anvil, tall, broad-shouldered, silent, lifted his hammer and brought it down again. The rhythm never changed. Each strike was measured, each movement deliberate. He didn't look up when the overseer entered. "Bass," the man barked. "You finished that hinge yet?" A slow nod. The overseer frowned. "You hear me, boy?" Another nod, the same calm, unreadable expression. That was all he ever gave them, obedience without soul. For 6 years, Bass Reeves had spoken only when necessary. 6 years since the day a Tennessee trader sold him to Robert Hutchkins of Miller County for $900, calling him a machine with lungs. 6 years of forged silence, of learning how to exist without being noticed. And in that silence, something had been building, something the overseers mistook for submission. Outside the shop, the plantation groaned under the weight of its own order. 200 slaves moved through fields of cotton that rolled like an ocean under the late summer sun. Whips cracked, voices shouted, wagons creaked. The air stank of sweat, soil, and power. Bass heard everything, though he never seemed to. He heard the patrols at night, the sound of boots crunching gravel. He heard the bells that marked the overseer's rounds. He heard the horses in the stable when the guards changed shifts. And above all, he heard the hammer of his own mind striking, again and again, shaping something no one could see. Robert Hutchkins believed himself a man of science. He called his system calibrated discipline. He kept ledgers of punishment like a banker kept accounts. Every lash, every chain, every broken spirit recorded and measured. He believed precision could make cruelty efficient, and efficiency could make it moral. Bass read those ledgers when no one watched. He wasn't taught to read, not properly. But a man who studies machines can learn symbols, numbers, marks. He learned to translate the language of control into something else, the blueprint of the plantation's weakness. The blacksmith shop gave him access to metal, nails, chains, locks. He made what they demanded and studied what they feared. He saw how their power was built not on strength, but on habit, on predictability. Every night, every shout, every footstep happened on schedule, and Bass memorized them all. The German smith, Otto Brenner, sometimes watched him work. Brenner was not cruel, merely curious. He'd written once to his brother, "The Negro Bass has a mind for mechanisms. I show him a lock, and he understands it in one glance. It unsettles me." Brenner didn't know that Bass was studying more than locks. He was studying the nature of restraint itself. When the war began in 1861, the world outside the plantation started tearing itself apart. Men marched off to fight for causes they barely understood. But Miller County remained the same: cotton, fear, and silence. Rumors of freedom drifted in from the east like fog. Union armies, runaways, liberation. The enslaved whispered at night, dreaming of escape. Bass stayed silent. He was waiting. The overseers thought him simple. The owner thought him loyal. But beneath the quiet surface was an equation, a cold, perfect calculation. Every cruelty was a variable, every humiliation a number to be balanced, and one day the sum would reach zero. The day began like any other. The morning bell, the stench of molasses, the groan of carts heading to the fields. Bass was called to the big house to shoe a pair of horses. Robert Hutchkins himself appeared in the yard, his face pink from drink and pride. "You're coming with me to Texarkana," he said. "We've business to settle. I'll need you to handle the horses." Bass nodded once. The perfect servant. Inside, he was already counting distances. The courthouse road, the crossroads, the bridge. Places where a man could vanish if he moved fast enough and killed cleanly. The wagon left at dawn. Hutchkins sat high on the bench, Bass behind the reins, the river mist curling around them like smoke. They passed fields half barren from war, soldiers' camps where gray uniforms hung like ghosts between trees. To Hutchkins, it was just another trip. To Bass, it was a pilgrimage, the road to transformation. They reached Texarkana near noon, a small, tense town. Half merchants, half soldiers, all suspicion. Hutchkins went into the courthouse, leaving Bass by the wagon with instructions to wait. He waited. He watched. He saw patrols move in lazy loops, the way men did when danger was routine. He noted exits, shadows, the angle of the sun. When Hutchkins emerged, laughing with a county clerk, the world slowed. Bass's hand moved before thought. He lifted the bundle of iron chains from the wagon bed, thick, heavy, balanced perfectly for the blow. The swing was clean, silent, absolute. The chain caught Hutchkins across the skull with a sound like iron meeting iron. The planter dropped instantly. Blood blooming in the dust, gasps, shouts. A clerk screamed for help. Bass didn't run in panic. He moved like he was following a plan written long ago. He threw down the chain, took the reins, and spurred the horses east. The wagon jolted forward, scattering townsfolk. A single rifle shot cracked behind him, the signal of a runaway. By sunset, the countryside blazed with alarm. 18 men gathered before midnight, overseers, bounty hunters, veterans too old or wounded for war. They called themselves hunters. But by dawn, they would be prey. The first to die was Douglas Patterson. They found him 2 days later in a ravine, his body positioned like a warning, strangled, his rifle gone. His throat crushed by hands that knew exactly how much pressure to apply. The next day, another man vanished. By the fourth night, 5 were dead. Bass didn't kill in rage. He killed with method. He used the forest like a second skin, moved without sound, waited without breath. He used traps he'd built from branches, counterweights, and snares, blacksmith's logic applied to murder. William Taggart, the leader, began to understand. He wrote in his field notes, later found beside his corpse, "This man does not flee. He studies us. He kills like he's counting." Taggart divided his men into smaller groups, hoping to cover more ground. That was his fatal mistake. Bass moved between them like smoke, dismantling the formation piece by piece. Each death came silently. A crushed skull, a throat cut with surgical precision. A drowned man held under 4 feet of water until the bubbles stopped. By the time Taggart himself was found, strangled in his bedroll, his companion asleep a few feet away, the county knew his name. Bass Reeves, the escaped slave who'd turned the wilderness into a graveyard. The newspapers didn't print the truth. They couldn't. The Confederacy couldn't admit that one black man had killed 14 white men, so they buried it in silence. Misadventure? Accident. Missing in action. But the slaves whispered it across plantations. The reaper of Miller County walks free. And in the blacksmith's absence, the forge stood cold, the anvil silent. Otto Brainer returned there often, staring at the tools Bass had touched. He would later write, "I thought I'd taught him metalwork. I was wrong. I taught him precision. I taught him patience. I gave him the language of control, and he spoke it in violence. Back on the plantation, Robert Hutchkins did not die. The iron blow fractured his skull, stole part of his memory, and left him trembling with fear of the man he'd once owned. He told his overseers, 'He'll come back for me. The blacksmith will come back.' They laughed at his paranoia, but in the long nights, when the wind moaned through the trees, even they kept rifles close. Weeks passed. Search parties scoured the Red River country. Bloodhounds lost the scent. Bodies kept appearing. Then nothing. The killings stopped. Winter came. The cotton rotted in the fields. The war bled toward its end, and the story of Bass Reeves faded into whispered myth. Some said he crossed into Indian territory. Others swore he joined Union scouts under a false name. A few believed he was still out there, in the pines, watching the roads at night, waiting for the next patrol to make the same mistake. But the truth, as later records would show, was far stranger. He hadn't vanished. He was evolving. Years later, in a courthouse basement in Little Rock, archivists found a torn page from a Confederate officer's journal. The entry was dated November 1862. We are dealing with something beyond comprehension. The fugitive anticipates our movements with mathematical precision. He kills only when necessary and never twice the same way. I've commanded soldiers less disciplined than this man. The handwriting ended mid-sentence. A brown smear crossed the page. Blood, perhaps, or rust from a forgotten chain. Bass Reeves would later be remembered by many names, some whispered, some recorded. The escaped slave, the blacksmith who hunted hunters, the reaper of Miller County. But the truth began here, in the hiss of iron, in the silence of the forge. In the mind of a man who decided that obedience was another word for death, he had learned the mathematics of survival. And on that November afternoon, in the dust of Texarkana, he began to solve the equation. By the time the frost came to Miller County, the story of the 14 dead men had already started to rot. Official reports were rewritten. Testimonies vanished. Families were told their sons had disappeared in the service of the Confederacy. No one dared say the name that caused dogs to whimper and bounty hunters to refuse payment. Bass Reeves, the sheriff, sealed his records. The plantation owners burned letters, and Robert Hutchins, alive but broken, spent his days staring at the forge where his blacksmith had once stood, certain that each hammer strike he heard in his dreams was a warning. The county fell quiet, but not peaceful. Fear has a sound. It creaks in the floorboards. It sighs in the trees. It speaks in whispers when the lamps go out. And in that silence, the myth began. The first sighting came from a Confederate courier who rode through the Sulphur River Basin on a moonless night. He told soldiers later that he'd seen a tall figure standing by the water's edge, the glow of a dying campfire behind him. I called out, the courier said, but he didn't answer. He just watched me, still as a shadow. By morning, the courier's horse returned to camp without a rider. The man was found 2 days later, face down in the river mud, his weapon missing, his neck marked by fingers. The soldiers said wolves did it, but the marks on his throat were human. Captain James Hardesty arrived in Miller County on November 15, 1862. He was a soldier's soldier, tall, clean-shaven, a man who believed in order even as the world fell apart. When the county commissioners begged for help, he agreed to lead the pursuit, not out of hatred, but out of duty. He began with the evidence. 14 dead. 2 missing wagons, multiple weapons unaccounted for, dozens of unconfirmed rumors. What he found disturbed him more than the killings. Every site showed precision. No chaos, no wasted movement. The fugitive didn't kill for revenge. He killed for efficiency. He'd taken what he needed, food, tools, weapons, and vanished like smoke. Hardesty wrote in his journal, "This man thinks as soldiers think. He fights as soldiers fight. He plans, executes, and withdraws with discipline. The difference is that he fights alone. He gathered 30 men, half veterans, half volunteers. They combed the timber with dogs, lanterns, and rifles loaded with buckshot. For a week, they found nothing, only cold camps and the scent of ash. Then, on the 8th night, the dogs began to howl. They refused to move forward. The handlers cursed, whipped, and dragged them toward the trees. What they found froze the blood in their veins. A clearing. A fire pit burned to coals. And nailed to a tree with a blacksmith's precision was a single iron shackle, the kind used to bind runaway slaves. Beneath it, carved into the wood with a knife, balance. Hardesty stared at it for a long time. Balance, he whispered, not vengeance. That night, half his men deserted. In Texarkana, the white population no longer spoke of the incident openly. Men armed themselves even in church. The word Bass became an unspoken curse. Children were warned that if they wandered too far into the woods, the reaper would take them. But for the enslaved, the story spread like gospel. They whispered it between rows of cotton, in kitchens, in dark cabins lit by a single candle. They spoke of a man who fought back, who turned chains into weapons, who didn't beg or run. "He killed 14 of them," an old woman told her grandchildren. 14. One for every year he lived as property. The owners called it dangerous talk. The people called it hope. Meanwhile, in the forests east of the county, Bass Reeves was not celebrating. He was studying. His camp was small, a bed of pine needles, a fire no larger than his hand. He ate sparingly, slept little, and moved constantly, circling the territory like a ghost checking his own perimeter. He watched the search parties from the trees. He could see their lanterns through the branches, could hear their dogs whining in confusion. He followed them silently, not to attack, but to learn. He saw how they signaled each other, how they rotated guards, how they left supplies unguarded when exhaustion took them. To Bass, it was the same as the forge: observe, measure, strike. Each movement of the enemy was a flaw in the metal, a weakness to be exploited. He kept the weapons he'd taken: 2 pistols, a rifle, and a knife. But his mind was sharper than any blade. He wasn't thinking of escape. He was thinking of equilibrium. The world had been unbalanced for too long. Every lash, every sale, every humiliation demanded an answer. Not rage, correction. One night, as rain poured over the timber, Bass found an old cabin half collapsed in the woods. Inside, a woman sat by the hearth, her hands trembling as she loaded a musket. She was a freedwoman, living on the edge of survival, her children asleep under blankets made of burlap. When Bass stepped through the door, she froze. "I'm not here to harm you," he said. It was the first time he had spoken in months. His voice was low, steady, rusted from disuse. The woman stared. "You're him," she whispered. "The one they call the Reaper." He said nothing. He ate what she offered: a crust of cornbread, a strip of dried meat, and when he finished, he asked quietly, "Where are the Union lines?" "Far east," she said. "Past the river. 100 miles, maybe more." He nodded, thanked her, and disappeared into the storm. When dawn came, the woman found a bundle by the door, 2 gold coins and a silver buckle stamped with the Hutchkins crest. A message left in silence: payment, not charity. Back in Texarkana, Captain Hardesty regrouped. His new strategy was containment, not pursuit. He placed sentries along every road, at every crossing. He turned the entire county into a cage. But Bass understood cages better than anyone alive. He moved outside their logic. He didn't hide from the searchers, he hid among them. He watched them pass within arm's reach, unseen. Sometimes he left signs: a broken branch, a snuffed fire, a scrap of cloth, just to remind them he was still there. The pressure of the unseen began to break men faster than bullets could. They argued. They drank. They deserted. A few turned their weapons on themselves, driven mad by the idea that the Reaper was watching. Hardesty's journal grew darker with each entry. "He is not man or myth," he wrote. "He is what happens when you teach precision to despair." Winter settled like a shroud. The fields lay empty, the cotton unpicked. Miller County's plantations, once symbols of order, now looked haunted. Owners who'd once bragged about discipline now slept with lamps burning through the night. Servants were told to sing while they worked, so their masters could know they weren't sneaking away. But fear doesn't restore control. It only corrodes it. And Bass's name became the acid that ate through the old world. When a slave escaped from a neighboring plantation that December, no one dared to chase him. The overseer muttered, "Let him go! I ain't joining the 14. That single sentence marked the beginning of the end for Miller County's slave system. On December 3, 1862, Bass returned to the Hutchkins plantation. No one saw him approach. He came through the cotton fields, where the stalks stood dry and brittle, whispering in the cold wind. He carried a rope, a knife, and a memory. The stables were the first to burn. The fire spread fast, horses screaming in panic, flames licking the night sky. The overseers ran toward the blaze, shouting orders. Bass slipped through the smoke to the punishment house. The lock broke easily beneath his hammer. Inside, 2 people waited, bound, bruised, terrified. He cut their restraints, handed them water, and said only, "Run when I say." Outside, chaos reigned. Men shouted, rifles fired blindly into the dark. Then one scream cut through them all. The overseer, Harold Vickers. Witnesses later said they heard a struggle, a gasp, then silence. When morning came, Vickers's body lay in the dirt, a branding iron placed across his chest, cold, clean, poetic. 6 enslaved people vanished that night along with Bass Reeves. They were never found. After the fire, Robert Hutchins's mind began to unravel. He told anyone who would listen that the blacksmith would return again and again until the ledger of pain was balanced. He stopped sleeping. He started drinking. Doctors called it trauma of the head. The slaves called it justice. By January, Captain Hardisty's pursuit had lost purpose. His men were dead or gone, his reports ignored. The Confederacy had bigger problems now: battles, blockades, starvation. One escaped slave, no matter how deadly, was no longer worth the cost, so the Reaper vanished from official record. His name faded from the ledgers, erased from the minutes of county meetings. But legends are harder to bury than bodies. Decades later, in the rebuilt courthouse of Miller County, an old clerk told a young reporter, "They say the blacksmith didn't die. They say he crossed the river, joined the Union, and came back wearing a blue coat. Maybe it's true. Maybe it ain't. But every now and then, when the wind blows over the cotton fields, it sounds like a hammer striking iron." The reporter laughed. The clerk didn't. "History," he said, "has a way of pretending that blood washes clean, but some stains don't fade. They forge themselves into the land." Far to the east, beyond the Red River, Bass Reeves walked alone through the winter woods. Snow clung to his shoulders. His breath came in steady clouds. He was leaner now, harder, quieter still. Each step carried him farther from the man he'd once been. Property, number, instrument. Ahead lay war. Behind him, ghosts. He didn't pray. He didn't boast. He only whispered one word into the cold night air, a word that had no master: freedom. The sound vanished into the trees like smoke, but the echo would last for generations. The winter of 1862 turned the Arkansas wilderness into a graveyard of silence. Frost coated the branches like bone dust. Rivers froze into mirrors that reflected only gray skies and ghosts. In that emptiness, Bass Reeves walked east. He had no map, no companion, no certainty. Only an instinct that pulled him toward freedom like a compass made of memory. Every mile he walked was a crime. Every breath he took was defiance. The Red River lay behind him, swollen with the ashes of burned plantations. The war rumbled faintly to the east, a distant growl of cannon and thunder that carried through the cold air. Freedom, they said, lived beyond that sound, but between him and that line of safety stretched 100 miles of Confederate territory, outposts, patrols, bounty hunters, and the endless whisper of fear. Bass moved like a shadow that had forgotten its body. He traveled by night, resting in hollows and abandoned cabins by day. When he needed food, he trapped rabbits with snares made from twisted wire. When he needed water, he melted snow over embers. When he needed faith, he forged it himself. In the second week of December, he reached the edge of a settlement, half-ruined cabins, smoke rising from chimneys patched with mud. It was a place where free black families lived under constant suspicion, caught between 2 armies that trusted neither side. They called it Rayburn Hollow, after the family that had founded it. Bass waited until dark, then approached a cabin lit by a faint orange glow. He stood in the doorway and spoke softly. "My name's Bass. I need food." "And news." The man who answered was older, his hair gray, his eyes sharp. He studied the stranger in silence, then opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. "You look like a man the devil's been chasing." Inside, the warmth was faint but human. Children slept on the floor beside a small fire. The woman of the house offered Bass a piece of cornbread without a word. He ate slowly, watching them, measuring them as he measured everything. After a time, he asked, How far to the Union lines? East, the old man said. You'll cross the Sulphur, then the Ouachita. After that, maybe 2 days to the big river. But you won't make it walking in daylight, Bass nodded. I don't plan to, the old man studied him again. You're the one they whisper about, aren't you? The one who made the hunters vanish. Bass looked into the fire. I did what needed doing. The woman crossed herself. The old man only said, You'll need papers if you plan to walk among white folks. There's a man south of here, name of Hayes. He's free. Has papers signed by the county judge. You get them, you might pass. Bass finished his meal, thanked them, and left before dawn. He moved without sound, his breath white against the black trees. Behind him, the Rayburn family prayed quietly, not for his safety, but for those who might cross his path. By December 18th, Bass reached the Hayes farm. The house was small but well kept, with a mule tied out front and smoke curling from the chimney. He waited until the man came into the field. Samuel Hayes was tall, broad, and cautious. He carried a musket and wore his freedom like a fragile badge. When Bass stepped from the trees, Hayes raised the gun immediately. Don't move, he said. Who are you? Someone who needs your help, Bass replied. The two men studied each other for a long moment, the freedman and the fugitive, mirrors of a life divided by chance. What kind of help? Hayes asked finally. Papers. Hayes's expression hardened. Those papers are my life, Bass nodded once. And mine. He moved before Hayes could decide. A step, a twist, a grip on the musket that turned it harmlessly aside. Bass didn't strike him. He simply held the man's gaze until understanding passed between them, quiet, cold, inevitable. I'll leave you your life, Bass said. But I'll take the papers, Hayes lowered his eyes. When Bass walked away, the musket still lay in the snow. Later that day, Hayes would tell neighbors that thieves had robbed him. He would never mention the look in the man's eyes, the look of someone who had already crossed the border between life and legend. With forged identity in hand, Bass began traveling by road. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried himself like a man who belonged. In daylight, he became Samuel Hayes, a free black trader moving between plantations. At night, he shed the mask and became what the county feared, the reaper of Miller. He moved through villages where soldiers drank away their courage, where farmers cursed the war, and where fear had turned every man into a spy. He listened. He learned. He remembered everything. The war had broken the South's rhythm. Patrols were understaffed, checkpoints lazy. The Confederacy was bleeding too badly to guard its own backyard. Bass slipped through the cracks like water through rusted metal. He crossed the Sulphur River on December 22nd during the afternoon shift change. The guards were eating lunch, laughing at a dirty joke. By the time they realized someone had passed, the trail was gone. Each mile eastward brought a new kind of air, less smoke, more silence. But silence, Bass had learned, was never peace. On Christmas Eve, he reached a burned-out settlement near the Ouachita. The snow was falling hard now, flakes thick as ash. He found shelter in the remains of a church, roof half gone, the cross tilted like a wound. Inside, he built a small fire from broken pews. He looked at the flame and thought of the forge. The rhythm of the hammer, the hiss of quenched metal. The memory was almost holy. Everything he'd become had started there, in that heat, in that silence. He took out the papers he'd stolen and studied them. Samuel Hayes, age 37, free man of color, stamped, signed, and real. Freedom printed in ink. He smiled for the first time in years. Then he tossed the papers into the fire. Freedom, he realized, wasn't something written on paper. It was something you carved out of the world with your own hands. The next morning, he followed the river south and came upon a patrol camped near the crossing. 6 soldiers in gray, 1 wagon, 2 horses. He crouched behind a fallen tree, studying their positions, the way he used to study iron before striking it. When darkness fell, he moved. He took the first man silently, a knife across the throat, catching the body before it hit the ground. The second he strangled with a rope, his breath steady, his movements slow. The third reached for his gun but never got the chance. By dawn, 3 bodies lay beside the embers of their own fire. The others had fled into the woods, leaving everything behind. Bass took their wagon and crossed the river. The horses' hooves broke the ice in steady rhythm. Each sound echoed like a drumbeat, announcing the birth of something inevitable. When he reached the opposite bank, he left the wagon behind. The soldiers would find it. They would follow. Let them. He had stopped running a long time ago. By New Year's Day, 1863, Bass Reeves reached the outer edges of Union-controlled territory. The landscape changed. Fewer plantations, more ruins. Signs of freedom appeared like faint stars before dawn. Men in blue coats. Camps of escaped slaves working for pay. The war's tide had turned. When he walked into the camp of the 3rd United States Colored Troops, the guards raised their rifles, then lowered them slowly. He didn't look like a runaway. He looked like a man who had seen too much to ever bow again. The commanding officer, Colonel Samuel Thompson, questioned him personally. Name? Bass Reeves. Origin? Miller County. Occupation before escape? Blacksmith. Skills? Metal, horses, maps, killing. The colonel paused. Killing? Bass met his eyes. 14 men, all armed, all dead. Thompson studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, "You understand what that confession means? It means I survived." The colonel nodded once. "You want to fight for the Union?" Bass shrugged. "I've been fighting the Confederacy my whole life." Thompson smiled faintly. "Then you're already enlisted." That night, Bass sat by the campfire among men who looked like him but spoke of freedom as if it were new. They laughed, told stories, sang low songs that trembled with joy and disbelief. Bass listened in silence. He didn't belong to joy yet. Freedom to him was not celebration. It was mathematics, unfinished, unsolved. He polished his knife, cleaned his rifle, and watched the sparks rise into the dark. A soldier beside him whispered, "You really killed 14? Bass didn't answer. He looked into the fire and said quietly, "They'd have killed me for being born." "I just corrected the mistake." The soldier nodded, saying nothing more. Some truths didn't need agreement. They only needed silence to breathe. The following weeks blurred into purpose. Bass trained with the other soldiers but needed no teaching. He could shoot, ride, track, and vanish. He moved through the camp like a ghost with orders. The officers called him the Scout. The men called him the Quiet One. He learned to read maps, to interpret movements, to gather intelligence behind enemy lines. When asked how he moved unseen, he said, "I watch before I walk." When asked why he fought, he said, "Because there's no other kind of living left." In March, he volunteered for a mission across Confederate territory to locate a supply depot hidden near the Ouachita. He went alone. He returned 3 days later with coordinates so precise the Union cavalry struck at dawn and found everything exactly where he said it would be. The colonel wrote in his report, "Corporal Reeves demonstrates strategic ability beyond expectation. He plans like a general and kills like a machine. Shows no fear, no hesitation, no remorse." Bass read the report once, folded it neatly, and placed it into the fire. He didn't need validation. He needed balance. At night, he dreamed of iron and flame, of chains cooling in water, of men choking in the dark. He woke without guilt. The war had given him something that slavery never could, structure without submission. For the first time, the system worked for him, not against him. He didn't fight for the Union. He fought for equilibrium. Each mission took him deeper into enemy territory, and with each one, the line between soldier and avenger blurred. To some, he became a hero. To others, a weapon. To himself, he remained a craftsman, shaping the world with the only tools he'd ever truly trusted: his mind, his patience, and his hands. When winter ended, the forests bloomed again and the snow melted into the rivers that once carried blood. Bass Reeves stood at the edge of a new world. He had walked from chains to uniform, from property to weapon, from silence to legend. But the war was not finished, and neither was he. For men like Bass Reeves, peace was just another kind of battlefield, and the next chapter of his life, the one that history would bury deepest, was only beginning. The spring of 1863 brought green back to Arkansas. Grass pushed through the ashes of war. Rivers swelled with melted snow. And in that fragile renewal, Bass Reeves became something new himself, neither fugitive nor slave, not even merely a soldier. He became function. In the camp of the 3rd United States Colored Troops, discipline was everything. Men drilled from dawn until the moon rose, learning to march, to fire, to obey. But Bass didn't need to learn obedience. He'd spent a lifetime under it. What he learned now was control, the difference between order imposed and order chosen. He rose before reveille, tended his weapons, and cleaned them with the precision of a craftsman tending sacred tools. He spoke little. He laughed never. The other soldiers respected him, feared him a little, and whispered his story in the dark like prayer and warning mixed together. They called him the Quiet Corporal. He didn't mind. Names were masks, and he'd already worn too many. Colonel Samuel Thompson saw potential where others saw danger. He called Bass to his tent one night after a long march through rain-soaked woods. The colonel's lantern cast a yellow glow on maps spread across the table. "Corporal Reeves," he said, "you know this country better than anyone. I want you to ride ahead tomorrow. Scout the old supply trail near Monroe. There's talk of a Confederate depot hidden in those hills." Bass nodded once. "Alone?" "Alone," Thompson confirmed. He hesitated, studying the man before him. "There's something I want clear, Reeves. You're under military command now. This isn't the wilderness. I need reports, not bodies." Bass met his eyes without flinching. "If I find both, sir?" The colonel sighed. "Then I'll trust your judgment." Bass saluted and left without another word. He rode out before dawn. The forest was still wet from the night's rain, the air thick with mist and pine. He moved quietly, his horse's hooves muffled on the soft earth. He traveled by instinct more than direction, cutting through gullies, crossing streams, following animal trails invisible to ordinary eyes. Each sound spoke to him. The snapping branch, the startled bird, the faint rhythm of marching far off through the fog. By noon, he found the depot. 2 wagons under canvas, 6 guards in gray, a shed stacked with crates marked Confederate ordnance. He watched from the trees, counting breaths. 6 men, 2 hours until sunset. No rotation, no discipline. He waited until the wind shifted and carried their voices away. Then he moved. When the first guard bent to stir the fire, Bass struck. 1 blow from behind, clean, decisive. He took the man's knife before it hit the ground. The second turned too late. Bass's rope looped around his neck, pulled tight, and the man folded without a sound. The third drew his pistol and fired, 1 wild shot into the air. The bullet missed. The warning did not. The camp exploded in confusion. Bass moved through it like smoke, his rifle whispering once, twice, 3 times. When it was over, 6 men lay still. He set fire to the wagons and left the flames behind him, licking the night sky. At dawn, Union cavalry found the depot burning. The report Bass delivered was brief. Depot destroyed, no further threat. The colonel didn't ask how. He didn't need to. He saw it in Bass's eyes, the same cold logic that turned necessity into execution. That was the beginning. Through that spring and summer, Bass Reeves became the Army's invisible edge. He carried messages through enemy lines, mapped Confederate positions, and gathered intelligence that saved hundreds of Union soldiers. But the official reports told only half the story. The other half lived in whispers, in the tales of men who vanished in the night. Slave catchers, overseers, scouts known for cruelty. They died in 1s and 2s, strangled or shot, their camps left untouched except for 1 symbol carved into wood or dirt, a single iron shackle broken in half. The officers dismissed it as rumor. The soldiers knew better. One veteran, Isaiah Washington, later recalled, he'd go out with orders and come back quiet, like always. Then a week later, we'd hear some bastard who used to hunt our people was found dead. Nobody asked. We all knew. In July 1863, during the Union campaign along the Mississippi, Bass was assigned to lead a reconnaissance patrol near Helena. He took 3 men with him, volunteers who trusted his silence more than speeches. They moved by night through swamp and fog until they reached a Confederate outpost guarding the river bend. From the ridge they could see torches, tents, and the faint gleam of a cannon facing the water. One of the men whispered, "We'll never get close." Bass said, "Watch." He slid down the slope, vanished into the reeds, and didn't return for an hour. When he did, he simply said, "Go back to camp. The job's done." At dawn, an explosion shook the horizon. The cannon had detonated from within, destroying half the camp. When the colonel questioned him, Bass said, "Their powder was wet." It was a lie. Everyone knew it. No one cared. The report read, "Enemy artillery neutralized through unknown means." That same summer, the war turned. The Union gained the upper hand. But for Bass Reeves, victory was not liberation. It was purpose without end. He lived between 2 wars. The public one fought with armies, and the private one fought in silence. In the first, he was a soldier. In the second, he was executioner and witness. Whenever the regiment passed near Miller County, Bass grew restless. He'd stare across the fields as though measuring distance not in miles, but in memory. The men who'd enslaved him were still alive. Some even thrived, hidden by the chaos of war. One evening in September, Bass vanished from camp. He returned 3 days later with a new rifle and blood on his coat. He never spoke of it, and no one asked. But weeks later, word spread through the Confederate ranks of a bounty hunter found dead near the Red River, his dogs poisoned, his throat marked by rope. His name was Robert Chenoweth, the man who had once hunted Bass himself. The soldiers whispered that the Reaper of Miller had returned. In truth, he had never left. By winter, Bass's legend reached beyond Arkansas. Union commanders used it to frighten Confederate scouts. Plantation owners whispered of the Black, Devil in Blue, a runaway-turned soldier who came for men who'd once owned others. Bass ignored the stories. Legends were for men who needed names. He preferred the quiet arithmetic of purpose. He kept journals, not of emotion, but of detail, routes, distances, timing. His entries were mechanical, precise, almost beautiful in their logic. Each life taken was a correction in the ledger of injustice. One line, written in pencil so faint it nearly disappeared, read, "Mercy is a luxury of the safe." In March 1864, Colonel Thompson summoned him again. "Corporal Reeves, intelligence, reports a Confederate detachment near the border, raiding supply lines. I want you to find their camp and report back," Bass asked. "And if I can't report back?" The colonel looked tired. "Then I'll know they met you." Bass nodded once, saluted, and left. He rode for 2 days through storm and mud. He found the raiders on the 3rd, a dozen men camped by the river, their horses tethered in a half-circle. He studied them for hours, memorizing their patterns. When the rain fell hardest, he moved in. He cut the horses loose first, sending them panicked into the dark. Then he set fire to the supply wagon. Amid the confusion, he moved like the storm itself, indistinguishable from chaos. When morning came, the camp was gone, swallowed by smoke and silence. Only one survivor staggered into town, soaked and trembling. He told the locals, he came out of the rain, tall, quiet, eyes like he'd already buried you. They didn't believe him. They buried him 2 days later. Back at headquarters, the colonel received no report. Just a bundle left at his door, 12 Confederate pistols, neatly arranged, tied with a length of rope. He didn't ask who left it. He only said softly, "God help whoever made that man." As the war dragged into its 3rd year, Bass Reeves became more than a soldier. He became an instrument history didn't know how to record. He wasn't fighting for the flag or even for freedom in the abstract. He fought for a personal equilibrium that existed beyond politics. He'd once said to another scout, "The world was built crooked. I'm just straightening what I can reach." The scout had laughed then. No one laughed now. In the final winter of the war, Bass was stationed near Vicksburg. The Union had control, but danger still breathed in the woods. Rumors spread of Confederate holdouts, snipers, deserters, men who refused surrender. Bass was sent to eliminate them quietly. He returned each time with fewer words, more scars, and eyes that seemed older than the country itself. He never bragged. He never confessed. But when soldiers sat by the fire at night, they'd feel the silence grow heavier when he passed, like a reminder that even among the free, some ghosts walked unburied. When peace finally came in April 1865, the world celebrated. Bells rang. Soldiers shouted. Flags unfurled. But Bass Reeves stood alone by the river, watching the water carry broken branches downstream. He didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He just whispered, "Finished," though he knew it wasn't. Because for men like him, wars didn't end. They changed names. He looked at his reflection, older, thinner, carved from iron and loss. For the first time, he realized he didn't know what to do with silence anymore. He had lived so long inside conflict that peace felt like an empty room. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object he'd kept since the day he fled Hutchkins' plantation, a piece of broken chain, cool and rusted smooth by time. He turned it over in his hands and then tossed it into the river. It sank without a sound. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to breathe. The Army discharged him in June 1865 with commendations for valor and reconnaissance. His papers listed his scars, his height, his service. Nothing of his story. The war had no language for men like Bass Reeves. No medal for those who fought their whole lives before the battle ever began. He walked away from the camp at sunrise, wearing a faded blue coat and carrying nothing but a rifle and memory. Behind him lay a nation reborn in blood. Ahead, a silence too large to fill, but Bass Reeves never feared silence. He'd forged himself in it, and though history would lose his trail for years to come, the myth would not rest. Somewhere in the whispering woods of Arkansas, when wind touches iron and river fog curls through the trees, people still swear they hear the echo of a single hammer strike and the faint voice of the reaper saying, "Balance."
The war was over, but peace never came. Not for the South, not for the men who had built their power on human chains, and not for Bass Reeves. June 1865, the banners came down and the guns fell silent. Across Arkansas, plantations crumbled into silence, their masters ruined, their fields gone wild. The air hung heavy with the smell of burned cotton and empty promises. Freedom had arrived on paper, but paper didn't erase memory. For the newly freed, it was a dawn filled with hunger, confusion, and fragile hope. For the defeated Confederates, it was humiliation wrapped in bitterness. For Bass Reeves, it was unfinished business. He walked east at first, through towns that didn't know what to call themselves anymore. In one, he saw a white sign nailed to a post. Colored labor needed must show papers. He stared at it for a long moment, then moved on. He no longer carried papers. His freedom had been paid for in blood, and he needed no signature to prove it. The Army had offered him a pension, a medal, even a promotion. He took none of it. He left the camp with his rifle, a satchel, and the silence had carried since the forge. He became smoke again seen one day, gone the next. A rumor moving through the wreckage of a nation. By autumn, whispers began. In the ruins of old plantations, men who had once been masters started dying in their sleep. Not many, just enough to make people notice. Each death was quiet, efficient, and eerily familiar. Throats crushed, locks broken from inside, doors found open but never forced. Local sheriffs blamed bandits. The survivors blamed ghosts, and those who remembered the old manhunt those who still spoke the name. Bass Reeves in secret felt the old fear stir again. In Miller County, the few who remained whispered that the Reaper had returned. One of those whispers came from a man named Thomas Vickers, the younger brother of Harold. The overseer Bass had killed during his final raid on the Hutchins plantation. Thomas was a Confederate veteran, lean, bitter, and obsessed. Had lost a war, a family, and a name worth speaking. All he had left was vengeance. In November 1863, had gone to Miller County to find the truth of his brother's death. People told him to let it rest. "Your brother's killer ain't human," one farmer said. "Has a curse in boots." Thomas laughed at them then. He was laughing a year later. When the war ended, he refused to surrender. He traded his gray coat for a hunter's gear and rode east with one purpose: to find Bass Reeves. He caught up with him near a Union camp on the Mississippi frontier. Or rather, Bass caught up with him. The official record says that Thomas Vickers was detained by Union forces. While carrying false papers and a loaded rifle, he claimed he was hunting a fugitive who had murdered his brother. Colonel Thompson, recognizing the name Reeves, ordered a controlled meeting between the two men. The report of that meeting still survives, written in the colonel's sharp hand. Prisoner was brought before Corporal Reeves. Upon citing the prisoner, the latter remained calm. The prisoner grew agitated and made accusations regarding his brother's death. Reeves listened in silence, then stated, "Your brother chose his path. I chose mine. He came to bring me back to bondage. I sent him forward to judgment." When asked if he intended harm, Reeves replied, "If he leaves here free, that's his choice. If he doesn't, that's mine." The prisoner was released under escort to Confederate custody. Outcome thereafter unknown. No record of Thomas Vickers exists beyond that day. By 1866, Bass Reeves was gone from the Army's rolls. Some said he moved north to Memphis, working as a blacksmith under another name. Others claimed he crossed into Indian Territory, where the frontier swallowed all names eventually. But scattered documents tell fragments of his trail small, sharp, undeniable. In one county, a man named Bassar paid cash for a horse, leaving behind a silver buckle engraved with the Hutchins crest. In another, a widow claimed a tall stranger came to her farm at night, asked for water, and left a handful of coins and a single bullet polished like glass. He was always moving, never staying long enough to become a man again, only a shape in the dark, balancing old equations. The Hutchins family, once rulers of Miller County, did not fare well. Robert Hutchins sold his land and fled to Texas, plagued by headaches and the echo of hammer blows that never ceased in his dreams. His journals, later found in a doctor's archive, reveal a mind decaying under guilt and fear. He wrote, "The Negro will come for me. I see him when I close my eyes. I hear chains in the walls. He is the sum of all our sins, walking upright." He died in 1869. The cause? Complications of head injury. His death notice mentioned nothing of chains or nightmares. His brother James inherited the ruins. He tried to rebuild the plantation, hiring freedmen to work for wages. But they worked without heart, and some left in the night, whispering that the ground was cursed. By 1870, the Hutchins estate was sold piece by piece to the very people who had once labored under its fields. A poetic inversion of ownership, like a balance finally paid. In those same years, the name Bass Reeves began to shift in the telling. To the white South, he became myth and outlaw, a murderer, a warning. To the freedmen, he was something else entirely. A symbol, proof that justice could walk on defeat and wear a human face. In sermons and songs, his story grew. Children were told of the man who had forged his freedom from fire and silence, who hunted those who hunted him, who vanished into the wilderness and came back wearing the color of victory. The Reaper became both angel and avenger, depending on who whispered his name. Around 1873, near the Sulphur River, a farmer clearing new land unearthed a hollow log filled with old weapons wrapped in old cloth. 3 rifles, 2 pistols, a knife, and a rusted piece of chain. Experts later confirmed the models matched those used by Confederate slave patrols during the war. But the real curiosity was the knife. Its handle was engraved with a single letter, B. No one claimed it. The weapons were displayed in the courthouse for years before disappearing during renovations. Some said a stranger came at night and took them. Others said they were never meant to be found. That same year, in a Memphis directory, the name B. Reeves, blacksmith, appeared for the first and only time. A man of height 62, dark complexion, quiet manner. He worked for 3 months, then vanished again. It was as if Bass Reeves had learned to live between the cracks of history, appearing only when necessity called. And sometimes necessity wore a face he recognized. In 1875, 2 former Confederate officers were found dead in neighboring counties. Both had been involved in the early manhunts of escaped slaves, both now respectable landowners. Each died the same way, strangled, with no sign of struggle, doors locked from the inside. Beside one of the bodies, carved faintly into the floorboards, were the words, "Forged Debt." No one ever connected the murders to Bass Reeves, but in the black churches of Arkansas, where stories lived longer than laws, people smiled quietly when they heard the news. The reaper was still collecting interest. By the late 1870s, another Bass Reeves appeared in the record, a deputy U.S. Marshal working out of Indian Territory. He arrested outlaws, hunted killers, and lived by a code of ruthless precision. He was tall, silent, deadly efficient. He killed 14 men in the line of duty. The coincidence of number was too perfect to ignore. Some historians insisted it was a different man. Others believed the fugitive had simply changed uniforms once again. After all, what was law to a man who had already rewritten it? When asked about his past, the marshal reportedly said, "What I was before don't matter. Judge me by what I do now." The people of Arkansas needed no proof. They already knew. In 1889, during construction of a new courthouse in Texarkana, workers uncovered an old campsite buried beneath layers of earth. Among the debris were fragments of metal tools, a half-burned shoe, and a piece of cloth scorched at the edges. When brushed clean, the cloth revealed a faint mark burned into it, a hammer crossed over a chain link, the symbol of a blacksmith, and perhaps of a reckoning. The foreman ordered it thrown away. The workers refused. They buried it deeper instead, saying softly, "Let him rest." Time moved on. The fields grew green again. Children forgot. But stories have longer lives than men. In the evenings, old freedmen would sit outside and talk as the sun went down. They'd tell their grandchildren, "You know why Miller County never rebuilt, right? Because it was built on stolen breath, and one man took it back." They'd tell of a man who had learned silence so deeply he could walk through the world like a whisper, unseen, unstoppable. A man who had turned the mathematics of cruelty against its makers. A man who never asked permission to be free, and when the children asked if he still walked the earth, the elders would smile and look toward the dark tree line. "Maybe he does," they'd say. Or maybe freedom just sounds like his footsteps. By the turn of the century, Bass Reeves, if he still lived, would have been an old man. But his shadow never aged. In every courthouse, in every story told behind closed doors, he lingered, a question that history never dared to answer. Was he hero or killer, justice or vengeance, man or myth? The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the middle, between the heat of the forge and the chill of the river, between the first blow that freed him and the last echo of the word head, carried through every silence balance. And though generations passed, the land remembered. Because some stories are not written in books, they are written in soil, in blood, and in the quiet places where the living still fear to listen. When the wind swept across the ruins of Hutchins Plantation, through the cotton fields and over the burned remains of the punishment house, it carried a sound faint and rhythmic like iron meeting iron. A single, perfect strike, and then nothing. Only silence, the kind a craftsman leaves behind when the work is done. Time is a patient thief. It takes years, faces, voices, and then, finally, names. But some names resist erasure. They survive not in ledgers or monuments, but in whispers, like a spark that refuses to die beneath the ashes. Bass Reeves became one of those names. A name too dangerous for history, too precise for legend, too true to forget. By 1900, the world had changed beyond recognition. Railroads carved through the wilderness where he once hunted men. Telegraphs replaced whispers. Cities rose where plantations had burned. And yet, in Miller County, no one built on the old Hutchins land. Farmers said the soil was wrong there. Plows broke for no reason. Crops withered without cause. At night, horses would shy away from the blackened ruins of the punishment house, long since burned but still visible in moonlight as a darker patch of earth. Children dared each other to run through it. Few ever did twice. Some said the ground still breathed. Some said it listened. In those years, newspapers began printing stories about a lawman named Bass Reeves in Oklahoma Territory, a deputy marshal who arrested thousands, faced down killers, and survived gunfights that would have ended lesser men. He rode alone. He spoke little. He shot only when necessary, and when he did, it was always fatal. 14 men, the papers said, died by his hand. The same number that had vanished in the Arkansas woods decades earlier. Coincidence, said the historians. Pattern, said the believers. Balance, said the wind. When reporters asked the marshal about his past, he deflected with the same quiet efficiency that had once unnerved overseers. What I was before don't matter, he told one journalist. Only what I do now. But one article, published in 1903 in a small frontier gazette, contained a line that most readers skipped. It quoted Reeves saying, "Freedom's a trade. Some men pay in words, some in blood. I'd just paid early." The editor thought it poetic. Those who knew the legend recognized confession. Meanwhile, the South continued to rewrite itself. Textbooks spoke of noble causes and tragic defeats. The names of planters returned to respectability. The violence that had built their world was softened into myth. But among the freed families, another history endured, told quietly, guarded carefully. The story of the blacksmith who had refused to die, who had taught the masters fear, who had turned silence into a weapon. Old men swore they'd seen him long after he should have been dead. A tall figure at the edge of the fields during harvest. A stranger at church on Sunday, head bowed, gum before the final hymn. A horseman who rode at dusk along the Red River, leaving no tracks. Some believed it was the marshal visiting old ground. Others said it was his ghost, ensuring the scales remained level. But for those who had inherited the weight of chains, it didn't matter. He was proof that freedom could defend itself. In 1938, when the Arkansas Historical Society cataloged the surviving plantation records, a box of old letters surfaced, water-stained, brittle, written in German script. They belonged to Otto Briner, the blacksmith who had once worked beside Bass Reeves at Hutchins Plantation. Among them was a letter dated December 1862, never mailed, addressed to his brother in Pennsylvania. The ink had faded, but the words remain. I cannot condemn him. The system that built him deserves the blame. We forged his hands, then chained them. We taught him order, then punished him for understanding it. He simply gave our lessons back to us. I see now that he was never property. He was the reckoning. The archivist reading the letter wrote a note in the margin. Philosophical reflections by a sympathetic observer. But the people who later visited the exhibit called it something else. Testimony. In the decades that followed, scholars debated endlessly whether the fugitive of 1860 and the marshal of 1875 were the same man. Dates overlapped. Records contradicted. Photographs blurred. No proof existed. Only parallels too precise to ignore, too uncertain to declare. But maybe the truth was simpler. Maybe the man who walked out of slavery in 1860 didn't become the marshal at all. Maybe he became the idea that gave that marshal shape. Because every generation needs its version of the Reaper. Someone to remind them that justice, once awakened, does not go back to sleep. In the 1950s, when historians interviewed descendants of the freed families of Miller County, they found the legend alive and intact. One old woman, nearly 90, said, "My grandma saw him once, said he came to the door after dark, asked for water, and left her a silver coin. Didn't drink, didn't smile, just said, keep your fire lit. Freedom's watching." Her grandson laughed when she told it, but she only looked toward the window. "Don't laugh, child," she said. Every story's true somewhere, and in that somewhere the blacksmith still walked. The official histories of Arkansas never mentioned him. Textbooks ended their chapters before 1863, but in courthouses, in archives, in the half-forgotten attics of old families, his shadow still lingers pressed between pages like a fingerprint of smoke. A canceled bounty poster, a broken shackle, a rifle serial number erased from inventory, pieces that add up to nothing unless you already know the shape of the man who once held them. Because Bass Reeves left no autobiography, no confession, no monument. He left patterns. He left absence shaped like intent. He left silence perfect, absolute, deliberate silence. And maybe that's the truest mark of his genius. He understood that legends don't need witnesses. They need echoes. Today, the land where the Hutchins plantation once stood is overgrown with pine and kudzu. The air smells of sap and wet earth. There's no sign of the big house, no fence, no fields, just a few foundation stones, half buried, holding the memory of a vanished empire. Sometimes hikers find bits of metal there, rusted nails, horseshoe fragments, a bent piece of chain. They bring them to local museums, unsure of what they've found. The curators clean them, label them, and quietly wonder if they once belonged to the man whose name still hums beneath the soil. And when the wind blows through the trees, it sounds, just faintly, like a hammer striking iron. A historian once asked in a lecture if Bass Reeves truly existed. Why did he leave no words of his own? The answer, though unspoken, is clear. Had already said everything that mattered with action, not language. Every word written about him was someone else trying to translate silence. Maybe that's why his story endures. Because silence demands imagination, and imagination keeps the dead alive. There's a theory among some researchers that the mind can record memory in the land itself. That trauma leaves impressions like sound etched into glass. If that's true, then Arkansas remembers. Every field, every river crossing, every courthouse basement still holds faint traces of him. Some nights, when storms roll in from the east and thunder shakes the Red River Valley, locals swear they hear more than thunder. A rhythm beneath the noise, iron, fire, chains breaking. They say it's just the wind, but the old ones shake their heads and say, no, that's the sound of work still being done. Because freedom is never finished. It must be hammered, cooled, and hammered again generation after generation until the shape holds. What became of Bass Reeves in the end? No one knows. Some say he died peacefully, an old marshal with a badge worn thin by years of duty. Others claim he vanished into the wilderness one last time, leaving his horse saddled by the riverbank. A few even say he walks still, a shadow at the edge of history, waiting for the next imbalance to correct. Maybe all of it's true. Maybe none of it is. But one fact remains undeniable. 14 men entered the Arkansas wilderness hunting one man. None came back, and the ripples from that single act of resistance, of calculation, of terrifying precision spread outward for generations. They changed how people whispered about power. They changed how the enslaved dreamed about freedom. They changed how the South remembered itself. The Reaper of Miller County wasn't born a hero or a monster. He was born a man, stripped of everything but wool. And when wool is all that's left, it becomes a weapon sharper than steel. So when you walk through quiet woods, when you hear the wind slip through trees like breath, listen closely. Somewhere in that rhythm, between echo and silence, is the pulse of the story that history tried to bury. The story of a blacksmith who built his freedom one strike at a time. The story of a man who refused to die his property and lived as legend. The story of Bass Reeves, the man who never existed and the truth that never stopped.